My grandmother, Edith, was more than just a regular churchgoer. She was the heart and soul of her church community. For almost 50 years, she poured herself into the church's activities, from singing in the choir and organizing potlucks to leading charity drives and volunteering whenever there was a need. Her dedication went far beyond what anyone else was willing to do. She wasn't just a participant. She was the person who made things happen. If the church needed a volunteer, she was the first to raise her hand. If someone needed support, she was there, offering a warm meal, a kind word, or a prayer. I grew up watching her tirelessly devote herself to the church, and it seemed like everyone else relied on her too. She often talked about how the church wasn't just a place of worship for her. It was her family, her community, and her purpose. It had been that way since I was a child, and I never questioned her commitment because I knew how much joy it brought her. She even credited the church for helping her survive the heartbreak of losing my grandfather when I was little. The church kept her going when nothing else could. But everything changed when she had a stroke in her late 70s. It was devastating for her. Suddenly, the vibrant, active life she'd known was taken away. She couldn't attend Sunday services anymore, couldn't sing in the choir, and couldn't lead the charity efforts that had been so important to her. Her world shrank almost overnight. Now, her days were spent in the small confines of her bedroom, with only my mom and me keeping her company. It was hard watching someone who had always been so full of life become so isolated. The hardest part, though, was the silence. The church that she had given so much to, almost half a century of service, seemed to forget about her. Not a single member reached out, no one came by to visit, and no one from the congregation called to check in. At first, I thought it was just a delay, that surely they would notice her absence and come around. But weeks passed, and then months, and still, the phone never rang. I saw the hurt in her eyes, though she tried to hide it from me. The people she had considered family had abandoned her the moment she became homebound. As time went on, she stopped bringing up the church entirely. It was as though she was erasing it from her life, much like they had erased her from theirs. It was hard to watch her spirit dim, knowing how much it hurt her to be forgotten. And yet, I didn't know then how deeply this betrayal would impact her final decisions that would send shockwaves through the very community that had turned its back on her. At first, I gave the church the benefit of the doubt. They had been a pillar of support in so many lives, and I couldn't imagine them abandoning someone who had given so much. I convinced myself that the lack of contact was just a slow adjustment, that they were waiting for the right moment to visit, to pray with her, to offer her comfort in this dark time. Casseroles, cards, prayers. Those were supposed to flood in any day now, like they did when other members fell ill or experienced hardship. But that never happened. Days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched into months. The phone stayed silent, and not a single visitor darkened our doorstep. The church that had been her family for 50 years had forgotten her. The place where she had invested her soul, her energy, and her time had moved on as if she had never existed. It was as if the moment she became disabled, she became invisible to them. I remember one particular Sunday morning vividly. I was sitting by her bedside, helping her with her breakfast. The air was thick with quiet, except for the sound of the fork gently clinking against her plate. My grandmother's eyes drifted toward the phone, lingering there as if she were willing it to ring. Her face was neutral, but I knew her too well. Behind those calm eyes, there was deep pain. She had never been one to complain, but I could feel the weight of her disappointment. She didn't ask anymore if anyone from the church had reached out. She didn't speak about the pastor or the congregation. The silence from them was like a betrayal that was too painful to even acknowledge. I could see it in the small ways. The way her hands trembled when she heard the word church, or the way she avoided talking about Sunday services, which used to be her highlight of the week. It was in her fading enthusiasm for life. Slowly, the woman who had once been the heart of her community was growing more fragile, her spirit quietly eroded by the people she had so faithfully served. The breaking point came on what should have been a day of celebration. Her 80th birthday. My mom and I threw a small party for her at home, just us hoping to brighten her spirits. My grandmother smiled politely, but her heart wasn't in it. That afternoon, as I helped her blow out the candles, I saw the loneliness in her eyes. All the friends she had made over the years, the congregation she had nurtured, none of them had shown up. No one from the church even sent a card. From that day on, she stopped mentioning the church entirely. It was like she had erased it from her life, just as they had erased her from theirs. It was a rare afternoon when the phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the quiet house. I answered, expecting the usual calls from doctors or distant relatives. Instead, it was Pastor Jim, The same pastor who hadn't reached out since my grandmother's stroke nearly 2 years ago. Is this Edith's granddaughter? It's Pastor Jim. I'd like to visit Edith today if she's up for it, he said, his voice warm but impersonal. I hesitated, unsure how to react. After all this time, why now? But when I told my grandmother who was on the line, her eyes brightened for the first time in months. She accepted his visit, and I could hear the faintest trace of hope in her voice. Maybe she thought they finally remembered her, that someone from the church had come to offer the love and comfort she so desperately needed. Pastor Jim arrived later that day, with his Bible tucked under one arm and a polished smile on his face. He sat down beside my grandmother's bed, and for a moment, I dared to believe this visit might mend some of the hurt she'd carried all these months. He greeted her warmly, asked how she was doing, and even cracked a few lighthearted jokes. My grandmother struggled to sit up, doing her best to match his cheerful energy despite her fragile state. But then, the conversation shifted. I know you've always been a great supporter of the church, Edith, Pastor Jim said, leaning forward in his chair, his tone suddenly too measured, too deliberate. And we're so grateful for all the contributions you've made over the years. I just wanted to ensure you've thought about your will, particularly the legacy you'd like to leave to the church. I froze. Was this really happening? My grandmother, who had devoted her entire life to the church, was sitting in front of a pastor who hadn't visited her once since her stroke. And now he was asking her about her will? About money? I felt anger bubbling up inside me, but I stayed silent, watching the exchange unfold. My grandmother, ever the poised woman, kept her face composed, but I saw the light in her eyes flicker and die. She had invited him in, hoping for prayer, for connection, maybe even forgiveness for their neglect. Instead, he came with an agenda. Her hands, once calm and graceful, trembled slightly as she nodded politely. "Oh, I've given it thought, Pastor Jim," she said softly, her voice betraying none of the pain I knew she felt. "Don't worry. The church will be remembered." The words sounded hollow. I could tell she was saying them just to end the conversation. And Pastor Jim, oblivious to the devastation he'd caused, seemed satisfied with her response. He stayed a few minutes longer, talking about upcoming church events and making hollow promises to visit again soon. But when he left, the room felt colder than before. I sat down next to my grandmother, unsure of what to say. She didn't cry or complain. She simply stared ahead, silent and distant. The last shred of connection she had to the church was severed in that moment. As I held her hand, I realized that this visit hadn't brought the comfort she deserved. It had only solidified her sense of betrayal. But Pastor Jim's visit would have far-reaching consequences that even he couldn't have imagined. What he thought was a simple conversation about her will was, in fact, the moment my grandmother decided to rewrite hers. And the church was about to learn that some legacies don't come in the form they expect. That night, after Pastor Jim's visit, I knew something had shifted in my grandmother. It wasn't the usual disappointment she'd been quietly carrying since the church stopped reaching out. This was something deeper, heartbreak that cut to her core. For almost 50 years, she had devoted her life to the church. It had been her sanctuary, the place where she found purpose after my grandfather passed, the space where she had built friendships and felt like she truly belonged. Now, all of that seemed to be unraveling before her eyes. We sat together in her small, quiet bedroom, the silence between us heavy. Her face was tired, her eyes reflecting a sadness that I hadn't seen before, even through her illness. She broke the quiet by reminiscing, her voice soft but filled with nostalgia. She talked about the picnics she'd organized, the charity events where they'd raised money for local families in need, and the laughter that once filled the church hall. "I used to feel so proud of everything we did," she whispered, her gaze distant. "The food drives, the bake sales, the holiday services. We were a family." There was a certain tenderness in her voice, but it was tinged with a sadness that hadn't been there before. Her hands rested on the blanket, trembling ever so slightly. She went on to mention the friends she thought she'd made through the church, the people she had once been close to. "I've been loyal to them my whole life," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "But they've forgotten me just like that, as if I never existed." I didn't know how to respond. How could I, when her pain was so evident? The people she had given decades of her life to, the people she had believed would be there for her, had disappeared the moment she could no longer contribute. It was clear she had been waiting, hoping for someone to care, someone to show up, not just to check on her will, but to show that they remembered her, that she mattered. But they hadn't, and it was breaking her heart. We sat in silence for a long time. My grandmother stared out the window, watching the setting sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, her mind far away. She didn't cry, but her sorrow hung in the air like a weight that pressed on both of us. It was in that stillness that I began to realize something profound. My grandmother's relationship with the church had been one-sided for a long time. She had poured her soul into it, but when it came time for the church to care for her, they had turned their back. As the hours passed and the evenings slipped into night, I knew she was wrestling with a decision. Something about Pastor Jim's visit had stirred something inside her, something stronger than sadness. It was a quiet resolve, a need to take control in her final days, to set things right in a way she hadn't before. She didn't say much more that night, but as she drifted off to sleep, I could see it in her eyes. The church had made their choice, and now my grandmother was preparing to make hers. After Pastor Jim's visit, there was a quiet transformation in my grandmother. She moved with more deliberation, speaking less about the church and more about the future. It was subtle at first, little remarks about her legacy, about fairness, and about what it really meant to leave behind something of value. But beneath her calm demeanor, I could feel the weight of a decision building. For years, my grandmother had planned to leave a significant portion of her estate to the church. It had always been her intention to support the institution she had spent her life serving. In her mind, that was her way of giving back, of ensuring that even after she was gone, her contribution would continue to help the community she had loved so dearly. But something had shifted. The moment that Pastor Jim had come into her home, not to check on her well-being, but to subtly remind her of her financial obligations, it became clear that the church no longer held the same place in her heart. She didn't say it outright, but the bitterness was palpable. The once unwavering loyalty she had for the church now felt like a betrayal. Years of service forgotten, replaced by cold opportunism. One evening, as I sat with her by the fireplace, she turned to me and said, "I need to make sure that what I leave behind means something." Her voice was steady, but there was a determination in it that I hadn't heard before. "What do you mean, Grandma?" I asked, sensing that this was more than just a casual reflection. "I've spent so much time thinking about what I'd give to the church," she said. "I thought it would honor all the years I dedicated to them. But now I see things differently." There was a pause as she looked down at her hands, her fingers lightly tracing the blanket draped across her lap. "They've forgotten me. They've forgotten what service truly means. And I don't think they deserve what I was going to leave them." It wasn't until a few days later that she quietly mentioned revising her will. She didn't tell me the details at the time, but I could tell that something had changed. The will had always been a reflection of her devotion to the church, but now it would be a reflection of something more, of her disappointment, of her hurt, and of her realization that true legacy is about more than just money. I asked if she wanted to talk about it, but she shook her head. "Not yet," she said, a faint smile crossing her lips. "But soon. I've got a plan." I didn't push her for more information, but I stayed by her side, helping with the little things, making sure she was comfortable and cared for in a way the church had never bothered to do. It felt strange, watching her come to terms with the reality that the people she had thought would be there for her were nowhere to be found. But at the same time, there was a strength in her that began to emerge, a quiet, firm resolve to take control of the narrative, to decide how she wanted to be remembered. Over the next few weeks, I noticed subtle changes. She met with her lawyer several times, making updates and adjustments, each meeting leaving her with a sense of peace that I hadn't seen in her for months. The church, unaware of the storm brewing, remained distant, absent in the way that had become all too familiar. And yet, as my grandmother began to finalize her affairs, it was clear that she was writing the final chapter of her life on her own terms. She had always been generous, always selfless in her devotion to others. But now, she was making sure that the legacy she left behind would reflect more than just blind loyalty. It would reflect the lessons she had learned in the final years of her life, about who truly cared for her and who didn't. Her change of heart wasn't just about the money, it was about making a statement. And soon, the church would realize exactly what that statement was. My grandmother's health was deteriorating faster than any of us wanted to admit. She had grown frail, and there were days when it seemed like every breath was a battle. I stayed by her side, watching her fight through the pain, determined to see her plans through. Despite the church's continued silence, she remained resolute, as if drawing strength from a well of quiet indignation. The weight of their neglect hung heavy in the air, but we never spoke about it anymore. There was nothing left to say. The people she had served for nearly half a century hadn't called, hadn't visited, hadn't even sent a card. It was as if she had ceased to exist the moment she could no longer contribute. Her absence from the pews had been all the reason they needed to forget her. One afternoon, after a particularly tough night of coughing and fatigue, she asked me to help her finalize her will. Her voice was weaker now, but her eyes still had that determined spark I'd come to recognize over the past few months. She had been thinking about this for a long time. I sat beside her as she pulled out the familiar manila folder from her bedside drawer. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," she said softly, resting her hand on the folder. "It's about my will." I nodded, not sure what to expect. She hadn't spoken about it much, except for the occasional vague comment. She gave me a tired smile. "You know, I always planned to leave something to the church. I thought it would be a way to keep giving back, even after I was gone. I knew this already. My grandmother had always been generous to the church, donating her time, her money, and her energy. It made sense that she'd want to leave something in her will for them. But after everything that's happened," she continued, her smile fading, "I've had a change of heart. I can't bring myself to leave them the amount I had originally planned." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "What are you going to do?" I asked quietly. She took a deep breath. "They'll get something," she said, her voice steady. "But it won't be what they expect." Her eyes glinted with the same determination I'd seen the day she decided to revise her will. "I'm leaving them exactly 1 cent, she said, her lips curling into a knowing smile. 1 cent for every year they forgot me after I became disabled. I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride and sadness at the same time. My grandmother, even in her final days, was still as sharp and thoughtful as ever. She had been hurt by their neglect, but she wasn't about to let it define her legacy. "There's more," she added, and her smile grew. "I'm giving the money I was going to leave the church to the charity they once shunned." I froze, my eyes widening in realization. She was talking about the black charity the church had distanced itself from years ago. They had once been connected, but when controversy arose over the charity's mission, the church leaders had cut ties, leaving the organization without the support it so desperately needed. "You're giving it to them?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. She nodded slowly. "They deserve it more than the church ever did. They've never turned their back on anyone, no matter their circumstances." I stared at her, completely awed by the woman in front of me. Even after being betrayed by the very community she had supported for decades, my grandmother had chosen to respond with grace and integrity, turning her disappointment into an act of generosity. She had found a way to leave behind a legacy that would truly matter, a legacy that reflected her values and her spirit. As I held her hand, I realized just how powerful her decision was. It wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming her dignity, about standing up to those who had failed her, and about making sure that her final act of giving went to a cause that truly embodied the kindness and support she had always believed in. That day, as I helped her finalize the details, I knew that this would be the final chapter of her life. But it was also the beginning of a new story, one that would carry her values forward long after she was gone. It was her final goodbye to the church, but more importantly, it was her final act of defiance wrapped in compassion. The day of my grandmother's funeral arrived with an air of solemnity and fake reverence. The church, which had ignored her for years, was suddenly present in full force. Congregation members, many of whom hadn't visited her once after her stroke, filled the pews, whispering condolences to me and my mother. It was clear most of them believed this was just another service, another chance to praise their community and bask in the legacy of one of their longest-standing members. I stood at the back of the room, watching Pastor Jim take his place at the pulpit, my hands clenched into fists as he began to speak. His words were polished, rehearsed, almost sickening in their hollow sincerity. He spoke of my grandmother's loyalty and dedication to the church, of the countless hours she had spent volunteering, donating, and supporting every event the congregation had ever held. But all I could hear was the silence that had enveloped her life once she was no longer useful to them. "Edith was a pillar of our community," Pastor Jim said, his voice soft and melodic. "Her love for this church was unwavering, her faith an inspiration to us all. We are blessed to have had her serve us so generously." My blood boiled as I listened to him paint this false picture of a perfect relationship between my grandmother and the church. It was infuriating. Where were they when she needed them most? Where was this community during her darkest days? I wanted to stand up and shout the truth, that they had abandoned her, that they hadn't lifted a finger to help her through her final years. But I stayed silent, out of respect for my grandmother and the moment. I knew the real reckoning was coming soon. As Pastor Jim continued his sermon, the congregation nodded along, most likely thinking about what would come next. The church had always relied on donations from members like my grandmother, and everyone probably assumed that, in her will, she had left them a sizable chunk of her estate. They were wrong. So very wrong. A few people gave respectful speeches about my grandmother's dedication, but I noticed no one spoke of her recent years, of how she was left to die in the silence of her home, with only family to care for her. When the service ended and the congregation filed out, there was a palpable air of self-satisfaction in the room. They had come, paid their respects, and no doubt expected the church would be handsomely rewarded for showing up to her final farewell. But they had no idea what was coming. After the service, as people started to approach me and my mother, I heard whispers. Subtle, but unmistakable. The church's leadership was already talking about her will. Pastor Jim, of course, had probably fueled the speculation with his impersonal visit months ago. I could see the hopeful smiles on their faces, their assumptions that my grandmother's estate would secure their future plans. They didn't know that the only thing my grandmother had left for the church was a final, deliberate slap in the face. As we left the church and headed to the reception, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Sadness for the loss of my grandmother, and a sense of quiet satisfaction knowing that soon, the truth would come out. The church thought they had won, thought they had gotten away with their neglect. But when my grandmother's will was read in the coming days, they would finally feel the weight of their actions. Or rather, their inaction. The people who had abandoned her, ignored her, and ultimately forgotten her, would soon realize that they hadn't just lost one of their most loyal members. They had lost everything she had once intended to give. And I would be there to witness every second of their disbelief. The day of the will reading was surreal. It had been a few weeks since the funeral, and things had started to quiet down. I thought this would be a private family affair, but I wasn't surprised when the church sent a representative. After all, they were expecting a substantial donation. The man they sent, Deacon Paul, wore a self-satisfied grin, looking far too pleased with himself as he settled into the chair across from me. The lawyer, a soft-spoken but firm man named Mr. Collins, began by going through some of the smaller bequests. My grandmother had been very specific about certain personal items, leaving her cherished jewelry to my mother and a few sentimental keepsakes to close friends. I listened carefully, waiting for the moment I knew was coming. When Mr. Collins reached the part concerning the church, I saw Deacon Paul shift in his seat, straightening his back and leaning forward slightly, as if preparing to bask in the glory of the church's newfound fortune. His smugness was palpable, and it made my skin crawl. And to the church that my grandmother served for nearly 50 years, the lawyer began. Deacon Paul practically beamed. "I leave 1 cent. The room fell in a stunned silence. For a few moments, Deacon Paul just sat there, frozen in disbelief. It was as if the words hadn't quite registered. He blinked rapidly, clearly trying to process what he had just heard. "I'm sorry," he stammered. "There must be some mistake." But Mr. Collins continued unperturbed. "No mistake. She has also left Pastor Jim and the associate preacher, individually, 1 cent each." The silence was deafening. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on the room as the reality of the situation sunk in. Deacon Paul's face turned from smug confidence to complete shock, his eyes wide with disbelief. It was as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. The church, which had ignored my grandmother in her most vulnerable years, had just been left with the most insulting amount possible. But the real blow was yet to come. I knew it was coming, and I had been waiting for it with a kind of grim satisfaction. Mr. Collins cleared his throat and continued. As for the significant portion of her estate, including what was originally intended for the church, Mrs. Edith has decided to leave it to a different beneficiary. She bequeaths the entire sum to the Black Community Enrichment Foundation. I had to stop myself from smiling. The Black Community Enrichment Foundation was an organization my grandmother had supported privately for years, one that the church had once turned its back on. Decades ago, when the foundation sought partnership with the church to help address racial inequities in the community, the church leadership, including Pastor Jim, had coldly rejected them, citing that the group didn't align with the church's values. My grandmother, despite her loyalty to the church, had never forgotten that moment. And in her final act of rebellion, she had ensured that the very money the church had been counting on would go to a cause they had once dismissed. Deacon Paul was speechless. He sat there, his mouth slightly open, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. I imagined that Pastor Jim would be equally as shocked when he heard the news. I couldn't help but wonder what the congregation would think when they found out that the church's anticipated windfall had slipped through their fingers, all because they had failed to support one of their most devoted members in her time of need. The people they had ignored, belittled, and pushed aside were now the beneficiaries of my grandmother's generosity. Deacon Paul left the office in a daze, mumbling something about needing to consult with Pastor Jim. Mr. Collins simply packed up his papers, unfazed by the church's stunned reaction. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, a sense of closure washed over me. My grandmother had always been a woman of deep faith, but she was also a woman who believed in justice. And with one final stroke, she had ensured that the church would never forget the cost of their neglect. They hadn't just lost the money. They had lost something far more valuable: their moral standing in the eyes of those who truly knew Edith. It didn't take long for the news of my grandmother's will to spread through the community. The shockwaves it sent through the congregation were immediate and severe. People who had once admired Edith for her decades of loyalty were now whispering behind closed doors, questioning why she had chosen to sever ties so publicly with the church she had served for so long. The congregation was split. Some, especially the older members who had known my grandmother well, quietly acknowledged the truth that was now glaringly obvious. The church had abandoned her in her time of need. I overheard hushed conversations during my trips into town, where longtime churchgoers would express their regret for not checking in on Edith after her stroke, for allowing the leadership to set the tone of silence. But others, especially those who had been closest to Pastor Jim, were outraged. They couldn't comprehend why she would cut the church out of her will, especially after everything she had given to it over the years. Some of them even went as far as to accuse her of being bitter in her old age, unable to accept that life had moved on without her. Pastor Jim was the most visibly affected. His public image had taken a severe hit, and I knew he was scrambling to control the damage. From what I heard through the grapevine, he was furious. The one scent that my grandmother had left him and the church felt like a slap in the face, and the fact that she had redirected a large sum of money to the Black Community Enrichment Foundation, a charity the church had once publicly distanced itself from, was nothing short of a public humiliation. He didn't take it lying down. In a sermon the following Sunday, he made a point of discussing the importance of loyalty and trust within the community. He never mentioned my grandmother by name, but his message was clear to anyone who had been paying attention. He hinted that her decision had been influenced by her declining health, suggesting that perhaps she hadn't been of sound mind in her final days. It was a cowardly attempt to rewrite the narrative, to paint her as a confused old woman rather than someone who had made a conscious, deliberate choice. But I knew better. I had been with her during those last days. I had seen her clarity, her determination. She had known exactly what she was doing, and no amount of spin from Pastor Jim could change that. The church leadership, desperate to regain control of the situation, even tried to challenge the will. They claimed there had been undue influence, that maybe my grandmother hadn't fully understood what she was signing. But they had no leg to stand on. Her will had been prepared months before her health took its final turn, and I had been there with her as she worked with her lawyer to finalize everything. The church had no grounds to contest it, and their efforts to do so only made them look worse in the eyes of the community. As more people learned the truth, that Pastor Jim had visited her not out of compassion, but to pressure her about money, the tide began to turn. Even some of the most die-hard church members couldn't ignore the coldness of his actions. The whispers grew louder, and more people started questioning the leadership's priorities. How could a church that preached love and support abandon one of its most faithful servants? Meanwhile, the Black Community Enrichment Foundation publicly thanked my grandmother for her generous donation. They were grateful not just for the financial support, but for the powerful message behind it. The church had once distanced itself from the foundation, but my grandmother had seen their work as a true embodiment of the values of love, inclusion, and service that she had always believed in. Her final act was a way of holding the church accountable, of reminding them what they had forgotten. Pastor Jim's sermons became more and more defensive as he tried to salvage his reputation. But no matter how much he preached about loyalty, it was clear that the cracks in the church's foundation were beginning to show. My grandmother's final act had forced the congregation to confront uncomfortable truths about their leadership, about how easily they had let one of their own be forgotten. The church wasn't the same after that. Attendance dropped as people drifted away, disillusioned by the hypocrisy that had been exposed. The church had once prided itself on being a pillar of the community, but now it seemed hollow. They had failed someone who had given them everything, and no amount of sermons could undo the damage. As for me, I watched it all unfold with a sense of bittersweet satisfaction. My grandmother had trusted me to carry out her wishes, and I had done just that. She had delivered her message, loud and clear, and no one could silence her voice, not even Pastor Jim. After the dust settled, I found myself reflecting more and more on my grandmother's final days. Her decision had been bold, deliberate, and most importantly, it had been about reclaiming her dignity. For almost 50 years, she had given her time, energy, and love to a church that didn't give back when she needed it the most. Her choice to leave them with 1 cent each, a symbolic token of her disillusionment, wasn't about revenge. It was about taking control of her own narrative, refusing to let them define her worth based on their neglect. The donation to the Black Community Enrichment Foundation became more than just a financial lifeline for the organization. It sparked conversations within the local community. Her story made its rounds, not just within the congregation but beyond it, and it got people thinking. More people began volunteering at the foundation, some even questioning the role the church had played in their lives and how much they had overlooked or excused over the years. My grandmother's generosity was now tied to a cause that worked to lift people up, something she had always valued in her heart, even if the church had lost sight of it. For me, the greatest revelation wasn't just in what my grandmother left behind, but in how she had lived. She had always been about service, community, and compassion. But in the end, it wasn't about loyalty to an institution. It was about loyalty to people, to values, to what was right. In her final act, she showed me the true meaning of faith. Not blind faith in an organization, but faith in humanity, in love, and in justice. As time passed, I watched as the church struggled to regain its footing. Membership continued to decline, and Pastor Jim's grip on the congregation weakened. The truth had come out, and while there were those who remained loyal to the institution, many found themselves disillusioned. My grandmother's quiet but powerful stand had exposed the cracks in their facade, forcing them to confront the hypocrisy that had festered within. I've often wondered if my grandmother would have been satisfied with how things turned out. The church, now humbled and smaller, no longer held the influence it once did. But I know that's not what would have mattered to her. What mattered was that she reclaimed her voice. She made it clear that she would not be forgotten, that her contributions weren't for the church to exploit in her final moments, but for the people who truly needed help. I visit the Black Community Enrichment Foundation sometimes. I see her spirit in the work they do, in the lives they touch, and in the smiles of the people who benefit from their programs. It's where her true legacy lives on. The money she had saved for the church now funds scholarships, community programs, and after-school activities for kids who need guidance and support, things the church once claimed to do, but had long since forgotten. In the end, my grandmother's legacy wasn't defined by the building where she spent so much of her time, but by the love and generosity she carried in her heart. She redefined what it meant to serve and showed me that even in the face of betrayal, you can stand tall, hold on to your integrity, and make your life and your legacy about something far bigger than the institutions that let you down. I miss her every day, but I find peace knowing that she didn't just fade away quietly. She made sure her voice was heard, even after she was gone. And as I move forward, I carry her lesson with me. The strength to stand up for myself, the courage to support those who truly need it, and the wisdom to never let others define my worth.